Hey guys, it's Jeff from San Diego Seed Company. Welcome to the Loretta Homestead. I am standing in front of our compost corrals. Why? Because composting is so exciting and I want to get you guys excited about composting. I know it's one of those things that can be daunting because there's so much information out there and you can kind of get inundated and then just not start. But it's such a vital part of the garden that I just want to give you guys everything that you need to know. But before I say all that, please don't forget to like and subscribe so you stay in the know anytime we post new content. All right, so let's say first things first. You do not need a 3-corral compost bin like we have made here. We're a little extra, so we just do things a lot bigger than they probably need to be done. We totally could have gotten away with just doing 1 or 2, but I will tell you my thought process of why we made 3 is this first one. If you come in, you can see this is just the raw table scraps, yard scraps. We've got egg cartons, we've got all the stuff that go into the compost here, and I fill this up, it kind of sinks down, we fill it up, it sinks down, then when it gets to the point where it's not really sinking anymore, I put it over here to the second corral, let that compost, and then once it's good and composted, we sift it and it goes into this third compost. So we always have a spot for our table scraps and yard scraps. This middle one is always composting, and then this is ready to use in the garden. Okay, so while I'm talking about the actual structure, I wanted to show you this cool thing that I think is cool. I could have totally just built 4 squares. I did that, but we also created these little removable pieces of wood so that whenever we get to this middle section and we want to turn it, it's a lot easier. So that's something you guys might want to think about when you're building your compost bins. But like I said, it does not have to be this complicated. Okay, so let's get into what compost actually is. All compost is organic material that has been composted. That means the microbes and the water and all the air and all these flies. I don't know if flies actually help with compost, but you're definitely going to get some flies. It breaks this down into something that's like this, that is just more accessible to your plants. Actually, in England, they don't call it soil, they call it compost because it's really, really like soil, but it's just composted green and brown material. There are several ways to make compost, but I'm going to show you how we do it on our homestead and how I think a lot of people do it in a backyard setting, which is not that scientific and not that glamorous, as you can see. So how do you make compost? It's really, really, really easy. There's only 4 things you actually need. That is carbon, which are called browns, nitrogen, which are called greens, air, and water. So what are carbons and what are nitrogens? There are tons of exhaustive lists on the internet that you can find of what exactly is a carbon, what is a nitrogen, what are the ratios to carbon to nitrogen. I want you guys to just kind of forget all of that and know you need a mix of carbon and nitrogen. The rule of thumb says you want 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But you look at the list and it says cardboard is X amount of carbon and it's X, you can kind of get bogged down with the ratios. That I just want you to remember, if you're adding nitrogen and carbon and water and air and then time, you are going to get compost eventually. So there's been agricultural departments across the country do all kinds of studies, and that's why they've come up with the 30-to-1 ratio, because it gets the organic material to break down faster. If you don't get those ratios perfect, it's still going to break down. It just is going to take longer. Okay, so how do I remember nitrogens and carbons? I think of nitrogens as table scraps, anything from the kitchen, like this big piece of broccoli. Now, should I have thrown this in the compost like this? Probably not. But like I said, it's going to break down eventually. One thing to remember, the smaller the pieces, the faster it's going to break down, because there's more surface area for the little bugs and microbes and bacteria to start breaking it down. So food scraps, definitely a nitrogen. Other nitrogens are like grass clippings are nitrogens. You can think of, they call them greens because it's things that have just been cut that are still green or were just recently alive. Browns are things like leaves and sticks from the garden that are brown. So what we do in our compost pile is not only do we have the 3 corrals, but we have this little ring where we put old dead leaves from our jacaranda and these little twigs. Now the reason that we don't just add these in right away is because, as you saw, there were lots of flies. So one thing that can happen when you're just adding only nitrogen and nitrogen and nitrogen over and over, like a lot of table scraps, like this old lemon and banana peels and stuff like that, it starts to stink and not really do that well. Actually, let me run inside to our kitchen and get our mini compost bucket and show you what I'm talking about. I'll be right back. Okay, so we're here right outside my kitchen. We just keep a little dish right here where we just throw all of our banana peels, eggshells, this is an old agave plant that we're not gonna use. Anything that we want to compost, we just put here, and then we just pick it up and take a few steps out to the compost. So the reason I wanted to show you this is because there's several ways to do it. You could get a big jar with a cover on it. You could walk out here every single time you chop something up. For us, having to do this once, maybe twice a day is manageable. We're pretty close to the house, but as long as you're saving your stuff and putting in the compost, that's the most important part. Okay, so now that I've put all the inside table scraps, nitrogen on there, I don't know why I did air quotes, it is nitrogen, it's not fake nitrogen. I'm gonna take some browns and I'm just gonna sprinkle it on like that. And then we're good. Okay, and that's really it. As long as you're giving this regular water, which that for us looks like maybe one time a week, coming out here with a hose and giving it a short little bath, you really just want it to be like a sponge. You don't want it to be sopping wet so the bacteria drown, but you want it to be wet enough so they have something to drink. Because the bacteria and all the single cell organisms, they're the things that are actually breaking this stuff down. Sometimes it's hot whenever you get it from the dump or any place that makes compost. You'll be like, oh, this is kind of warm. It's because that bacteria is putting off heat whenever it makes it. Okay, so like I mentioned, we've got our 3 bins. This is where we put all of our greens and browns and water. And that 4th ingredient is air. So that's where the turning comes in. So once this is full, I'm gonna turn it. I'm gonna basically take everything out, put it into this bin. I'm gonna water it again. If I had to guess, I haven't been keeping track, but I would say it's taken about 2 months to get from a full bin number 1 to what you see here, which is about maybe halfway, 2/3 of the way, all composted. So you'll see here, there's compost in there, but there's also big pieces that have still yet to break down. So I'm gonna let this compost for a little bit longer, but what I'm also gonna do is turn it. And so you can see I've started that process here. I just bring a tarp out, take the removable slats out, and come out and take all the stuff that's on the bottom, on the inside, which is more composted, and get it out of there. Get some air in there, and then I'm gonna take all this out and then put it all back. Okay, so earlier I talked about heat, and that's one thing that you're gonna hear competing things about online is that, oh, you can throw anything you want in compost. Weed seeds, disease from leaves, and the heat's gonna kill those things. And that is true, but in our compost, I don't measure it. I don't have a compost thermometer, so I don't know how hot it's getting. So when I get to the end of the summer and I have all those squash leaves that have the powdery mildew on them, I'm taking those out of our yard and burning them, sending them straight to hell, because I don't want to add more powdery mildew into our compost. Now, there are things that you can't avoid, which are vegetable seeds. So very often we get potatoes growing out of our compost. We get all these long, leggy, spindly plants that are reaching for the sun. I don't even know what that is. But that's just one thing that you're gonna have to deal with when you're making backyard compost, is that you're gonna get things like this in here. Here's another one. This looks like some kind of, I think that's a squash cotyledon. I'm not for sure. Yeah, it totally is. It's fuzzy. So that's from some squash plant or pumpkin or something that got in there, and it germinated because it's wet and there's tons of nutrients in there. So it's just gonna happen. So you're gonna have to do a little extra weeding, quote unquote, because tomatoes aren't necessarily weeds, but if they're not where you want them to be, they become weeds and you gotta pull them out. So that's one thing to look out for when you're making your compost. Okay, so let's just say I've turned this whole thing, I've put it back in there, I've given it some water, it's moist, and we let 1 month go by. And I want to get some compost right now. I said earlier it's only halfway composted. That doesn't mean I can't use it. So let me show you what that looks like. So there's never going to be a scenario in backyard compost where everything breaks down at the same exact rate and you're going to get this beautiful compost all at once. There's always going to be things like, here's a lilikoi shell that just didn't break down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw that back over there. There's going to be woody pieces that get in there that don't break down as fast. You can see that just broke in my hand. It's starting to break down, but it's definitely not compost. It's definitely not in a state where your plants could benefit from those nutrients. So I'm going to put it over there. At some point, you are going to have to sift your compost. So I'm just going to put a couple shovelfuls in here and just sift it onto the tarp just so you can see what finished compost is going to look like. Okay, so it's rained a lot recently, and I just watered this as I was turning it before we started shooting. So not everything came out, but look at that. That is beautiful. And as I said, there's still little plants in there. There's also definitely going to be some seeds in here that haven't germinated yet. So that's what I was talking about. When you put this into your garden beds, there's going to be things that pop up that you're like, hey, I didn't plant that. It's coming from your compost. So now I've got two options. I can dump this back into the first bed, or sometimes there's things in here that I know just takes so long to break down. I'm going to use it as mulch, and what I do a lot of times is just put it right there. Okay, so now we've got usable compost to add into your garden. When would you do this, and where and how? I'll just go over quickly because there's a lot to this. I would put this maybe an inch thick on top of our beds right before we plant anything. Maybe give it 2 or 3 days before you plant so it can inoculate the soil and get all this goodness working into the soil, so when you put your plants in, your plants can access it. Okay, so that's how we make compost on our homestead. This is one of the many ways. What are the ways that you guys make it? Because we're always trying to learn here. We're a seed company, we're not a compost company. So we really want to hear how you guys do it, and maybe we can learn something. But the real point of this video is for those who are gardening now but not making your own compost. It's not that complicated. Don't get scared. Just get out there and make some and keep growing.